The difference was this time was I could actually see them. And they look kind of like your typical, gray aliens that's commonly described, but they're kind of more of a white porcelain configuration with a blue to purplish hue.
Well, hello there. I am Cool Gray, and this is Cool Gray in Studio A. Happy New Year, everyone. It's 2023. I don't know about you, but I am totally ready to take 2020, 2021, and 2022, pack them all up, tell them to take a hike. I am done, so done with them for very many reasons. But I'm very optimistic. I've got that beginning of the year hopeful feeling that 2023 is going to be a year full of great things, hopefully related to this podcast, since that's why you're here. And speaking of podcasts and new beginnings, we are beginning a brand new series today. Some of you I know have been anxiously awaiting this moment. It's episode 1 of the second series of this podcast, and it's called Paranormal Encounters. Wowza. I have got 6 amazing, extraordinary guests lined up for you. This episode is going to be just a little bit longer than usual. I try to keep these to just about an hour. This one is probably going to be a little longer than that. Why? Well, we have a little bit of business to take care of this morning, so let's get right down to it. I want to introduce the series, but I also want to reach out to you as a listening audience and engage you in this way. If you're joining me for the first time because of this series, I would love to encourage you to go back and listen to the first series, another 6 episodes. That series was called Creativity Born of Trauma. So it might have you wondering, what is this podcast about? Everyone's supposed to have a niche. My niche is eclecticness. I don't even know if that's a word, but because I am so eclectic, I can use it if I want to. And I just did. The idea here is to bring you interesting conversations with interesting people. The people I want to talk to and the people I hope you want to listen to. It doesn't matter what the subject matter is. What matters is, are we having engaging, interesting conversations that stimulate you to think more deeply about a wide variety of topics? Creativity and trauma have a lot to do, both of them, with why I started this podcast to begin with. And so it just made sense to start there. Just prior to starting the podcast, I was crocheting for a living, making very intricate, textured, heirloom level home decor, mostly Afghans for people. And that required me to sit very still for many, many hours in one place. And during that time, I listened to a lot of audiobooks and a lot of podcasts about things that I was personally interested in. And I do have a lifelong interest in the paranormal. That's been with me, I would say since about middle school. So I listened to a bunch of that stuff. And after almost 3 years of taking in information in that area, I just really felt that I needed to do something with it, some form of creative expression in response to all the things that I had been listening to. And this is that. So I've reached out to some people. I've made some new friends. I've made some amazing new contacts, and I have some amazing stories for you. Before we get to the first one, I want to let you know that right now, since this is a new podcast and I'm really just kind of getting started, trying to build audience, build community, and really perfect what I'm doing, I take it very seriously. This is, in a way, it's a memoir. In a way, it's a legacy. And because I'm taking it seriously and because I want it to be something that I can leave behind that says I was here and this is what I did during that time, I want these podcasts to have me infused in them, but also to show my spirit of excellence that I'm trying to bring to this. And so you can help, even if you're tuning in for the very first time. If you enjoy this episode, why don't you share it on whatever social media platform you're most active on? Drop a link, tell somebody about it, encourage them to look it up, help bring in a new community member and engage somebody. Another thing you can do is just take a couple of minutes. Find the link in the show notes to the listener survey that I've created on my website. It wouldn't take you more than 5 minutes to fill it out. You got something better to do? I think not. Just pop on over there and fill it out. And when you do, you'll be automatically entered into a contest. I am offering a prize. The program that I'm using to track those responses will tell me the order in which they came in. And if you are the lucky listener, that is the 10th person, if you properly complete the survey and you are the 10th person, I am going to mail to you a cup phone holder for your car that you could put your phone in and listen to this podcast on it while you're driving someplace. Podcasts are great for long road trips, aren't they? Fill it out, be entered, and if you win, I will mail that to you along with a personal signed note thanking you. So why don't you do that? Check the show notes for the link. So today is episode 1 of Personal Paranormal Experiences. What am I doing? Do I believe in this stuff? What is this series meant to do for you? Well, what I believe and what I don't believe is not the issue. I'm not here to convince you of anything. My feelings about all of the phenomena you'll be hearing about in this series is still evolving. I don't have the answers. You don't have the answers either. And neither do any of my guests. What they have is a story to tell about their own personal experience. And what I want to do is encourage you to do what I do. And that is take a few minutes to think more deeply about what you're hearing. Most of us have, I would say, either no interest at all, some kind of knee-jerk reaction, or just a casual, woo-woo kind of feeling about the paranormal. You say the word and people's eyes open up a little bit wider and they go, oh, tell me more. Oh, campfire stories. But I'm not trying to amuse you here. Most of us are not doing deep dives into this subject, and I'm not expecting you to go and do that. Maybe somebody will. But what I'm trying to do is just to say, hey, have you taken any time to think about this? I would venture a guess that most of you listening to this series have not met someone personally in your life and had an opportunity to sit down face to face and hear them tell a story of a lifetime of sightings of UFOs and all of the things that go along with it, how it's affected their family, how it's affected their lives, and genuinely altered the trajectory of their entire life. Do you know anybody in your life like that? Well, here's an opportunity to meet one. And once you've met him, take it seriously enough to spend some time wondering what is going on here. I mean, I'm bringing you one story, but my interest in this subject matter goes deeply enough that I know that there are thousands and thousands of people that have come forward and gone on record with similar experiences. And that tells me that this is not nothing. It doesn't tell me what it is. I don't know what it is. And I think you'll hear in here that Mike doesn't really quite know what it is either. He's not running an agenda. I'm not running an agenda, except to say, engage your brain. Turn over some rocks and poke some stuff with sticks. That's what I have said I'm about from the beginning, and that's what I'm about now. That's what I was about with the previous series. That's what I'm about with this series, and that is what I will be about in the next series. So turn on your mind, open up your ears, take it all in, let it marinate, and let me know what you come up with. Your feedback actually matters a lot to me. So you can comment on the blog. There's always a blog entry on my website that goes along with every one of these episodes. And you can find a link to that in the show notes, or comment on my social media. Find my Facebook page, my Instagram page. I want to know. So engage, people. I can get lonely without that. All right. Well, I've chatted enough about all of that stuff. Told you about the series, told you about the contest, wished you a happy new year. And now we're going to dive right into this amazing episode. I'm just going to share this brief message with you for about 2 minutes, and then we'll get right into introducing our guest today. Hey, Cool Gray here. I want to talk to you for just a minute about Patreon. Patreon is a social media platform where you can support this podcast, my YouTube channel, and other artists who are doing what I'm doing, which is making stuff happen on our own dime, on our own time. This is a way that you can support those efforts. And if you're enjoying this podcast, I would encourage you to join me over there, not just because it helps me, but there are perks, people. Let me tell you what those are. At the very first tier of support, just $5 a month, you will get 24-hour advance access to every single episode in its audio format. At the $10 level and above, you will get a full video version of every single episode. That is not available anywhere else. Why is that amazing? Well, you'll be able to learn such things as, what do my guests even look like, especially when they're talking? Did I apply my eyeliner evenly? Am I wearing the same outfit as I was last episode? Do I have broccoli in my teeth? These are the things that are burning in your souls. I know you want to know the answers, and that's where you can find out. If you're not feeling goofy, I can also tell you that you'll get exclusive access to bonus content not available anywhere else, monthly minisodes and quarterly blooper reels. I am also offering fan access. You can make requests. You can say, hey, Cool Gray, make a minisode about this, or why don't you talk about that? And I will listen to you. I may not actually do it, but I will listen to you. I am doing everything that you see here, from the writing to the editing to the recording to the promotion to the graphics. It's all me by myself, and I'm just really trying to cover my costs. I would love to welcome you over there to become a part of this exclusive community that gets all the nifty stuff that the rest of you are missing out on. So come on over to patreon.com, find me as Cool Gray Studios. There's a link in the show notes that will take you there more directly, and I thank you for considering that. I'd like to introduce my guest today. Mike Stevens is a seasoned paranormal researcher and investigator. His own experiences started around the age of 3 and have been going on ever since. Dealing with his own experiences has led him to help other experiencers overcome their trauma as well as his own. He's worked to change the stigma surrounding the abduction phenomena by promoting public awareness of the subject and by encouraging and supporting others through his Granite Sky Services organization. Mike has been interviewed by newspapers, television, and radio about his involvement in the paranormal and UFO communities where he lives in New Hampshire, as well as internationally. He's become a trusted source for New Hampshire's rich UFO history. He's also the subject of author Nomor Slevic's book, Granite Skies, which documents most of his experiences. Mike, I am so glad that you're here. Thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I am especially glad to have you here with me today. I reached out to you as well as to Nomar, who wrote the book Granite Skies, after reading the book, because for me personally, I wanted to deepen my understanding of what is going on with this whole phenomenon. A lot of it's become mainstream as far as it being more widely accepted than ever that something's going on out there. But for me, beyond what I can be exposed to in public media, being able to have a one-on-one conversation with someone who's been there really helps me. How much of that do you do, talking to people and being interviewed about and having to tell your story over and over?
Quite a bit. Usually, so sometimes it's more in an interview format like this or something, but a lot of times even just dealing with another experiencer, I have to kind of tell them what I've been through just so they know the playing field's, open and acceptable. So, it relieves a little bit of their tension that I'm okay to talk to about.
Do you find that to be therapeutic, or is it burdensome for you?
It really depends. You have seasons where it seems constant, like getting into October and Halloween, everybody wants spooky stories. So sometimes it could be like, multiple times a week of just repeating yourself, and that gets burdensome. But if you're dealing with actual individuals, the work itself is rewarding, so that doesn't seem as burdensome. That's actually a pleasure.
I'd love to just revisit the fact that you've introduced yourself by saying that your personal experiences began right around the age of 3. And that seems like a very tender age to try to wrap your mind around something that I'm still trying to understand myself. Can you tell our listeners, who, by the way, are not necessarily interested in this topic on a day-to-day basis, this might be the first time they've heard anybody talk about this on the level that you'll be talking about it. So could you tell us just a little bit about what that first experience was like?
Yeah, absolutely. We're in a small town called Southampton, New Hampshire, just over the Massachusetts line at my grandmother's house. There was some type of family gathering going on because there were extended family there, my aunts, uncles, and that sort of thing. The way my grandmother's house was set up, you walked in through the kitchen, then there was a dining room, and right off the dining room was a 3-season porch that overlooked the backyard. I walked through the dining room, and when I got by that porch, there was immediate calling to get outside, like just this internal urge, almost like a primal thing, like you didn't know where it was coming from, but you had to get outside. You knew that there was like an intensity behind it and the feeling. I don't remember how I got outside, but when I got out in the driveway, I found myself standing there. My cousin, who's a couple months older than me, was already out there standing in the driveway. And it never should have happened. You know, we never would have got past that many adults and ran outside in the middle of the night, but there we were. And the next thing we know, the woods behind my grandmother's lawn, there was this bright red light that you started silhouetting the trees. And finally, this light rose. And as it broke the tree line, you could make out this saucer shaped object. You know, it's the typical domed bottom, domed top type object.
How large was it?
At that point, we couldn't really tell when it got closer. My best guess is about 40 feet wide, maybe about the same in the middle, maybe a little smaller top to bottom. So from there, it kind of floated towards the end of the driveway and hung in the air next to this tree that was at the end of the driveway. And I use the word floated because it was almost like throwing a paper airplane or something. There was no propulsion or, you know, engine noise or, you know, like forced stop and go. It just kind of floated. So when it got there and it kind of parked itself and parked, I mean, just hovering in the air, it wasn't actually on the ground. It just sat there. And that's when we could start to see this row of lights around the center. And they were rolling around. It wasn't like individual bulbs. It was more like a liquid, just color flow that rotated with the object. And it was a softer white, light blues type thing. So we were staring at it. We felt like we were being watched. And almost kind of like when we made that connection with it, that color bar changed to brighter reds and oranges and started flashing a lot faster and more intensely. When that happened, almost like when you open your car door at night, some type of interior light came on this thing with a soft yellow light. And when that happened, it revealed a row of windows above that center bar. And in the windows, we couldn't see any details, but we could see like the shadows of like shoulders and heads of a humanoid figure, but we couldn't really make out any details. From there was a big standing blank in my memory. The next thing I remember, this object was at the other end of the driveway by the street, kind of next to a telephone pole. It sat there for a minute and then just shot off and kind of disappeared into a dot.
That's a lot of detail for a 3-year-old. You seem to remember it very, very clearly. Do you remember what you were thinking during that encounter?
It was just really terrified. There was almost, if you were in the woods or something and you sense when an animal's around, or if you saw a bear, so it was kind of that type of feeling, like this isn't good, what's going on, even though you didn't really know. Some of it, or a lot of it, you know, it's the unknown factor.
How did that experience end?
Well, that was my standing memory. That was the end of that experience.
And did you talk to the adults in the house about it at the time?
At the time, I don't know that we did that night. Growing up, me and my cousin, it was just a surface conversation. We never really got into depth about it, but we grew up running around telling everybody, hey, remember the UFO we saw? And everybody was just like, yeah, and
so
let it go.
But your cousin's memory was corroborated by yours, and you talked about, I imagine you weren't having a deep discussion about it at 3, but as you talked about it over the years, you were corroborating each other's experience?
No, we left it at that surface conversation too for many years. Remember the UFO we saw when we were kids? Yep, and just left it at that. It would be many years later before I would actually sit down and say, hey, what did you actually remember?
Why do you think that was? Was it just a factor of your youth, or were you actively avoiding talking about it?
I, for a long time, really just avoided talking. I was the poster child, you know, for a hide behind my mother's leg. I knew how to talk for almost 2 years before I'd speak to my grandmother, and we lived right next door to her for many years. Yeah, I had already developed, severe social anxieties, fears of street lights, like going under them in the car at night, you know, and it was a fairly rural area. It's not like there were a lot of them, but things like that. From a very young age, I already started having all these anxieties and
a
fears.
Sense of danger. Yeah. Not long after that, you began to have, you're still very much a child, according to what I read in the book, and you began to have regular visits. Can you just touch on that a little bit? I certainly want everybody to read the book, and there'll be links in the show notes for how you can do that. I certainly recommend it. It's an easy, pleasant read, much more pleasant for me than the person who went through it, I imagine. But it is fascinating. Tell me about those visits that you were experiencing while you were still quite young.
Yeah, so it was about 8 or 9 at this point, and we lived in the house next to my grandmother at this point, not across the street, but like on a shared yard, same side of the road thing. And my bedroom was in the back corner. And what would happen is this would happen 2 to 3 times a week, if not more, over a period of several weeks. What I would see was a little white ball of light come in through the window. When the ball of light got into the room, it would kind of disperse into these figures. They looked like shadows, but there was, I don't want to say smoke, but movement within the shadows. And I don't know if that's just my memory blocking out. I'm not saying that's exactly what it looks like, but that's how I remember it. But when they came, they were usually what I perceived just energetically that two were male, and they were very strict or militaristic, not in a aggressive, like physically aggressive way, but they very much seemed to have this attitude of he needs to learn his lessons. This needs to be done. With them was also a female entity, and she seemed to pace more in the corner. She seemed more motherly, and she didn't like the strict format. She wanted more of a personal interaction, it seemed. And with them, there was also a small male entity, a child, a boy. He would sit on the floor at the end of my bed. I think my perception of the whole thing was that whatever they were teaching me, they were teaching him at the same time and kind of comparing. I don't really remember much of those lessons. The only real thing I do remember about that is once the female approached the bed, and she presented me what looked like an arrowhead or a spear tip made out of glass or crystal. And she said, "This is the key." Now, I have no idea if that's metaphorical or a physical key or whatever. And the only other real thing I remember was I was allowed to get on the floor and sit on the floor with the boy one. And so the first thing I did was I asked him, "What are you?" And just this image of Rosie the robot from the Jetsons beamed into my head. And then nobody laughed out loud, but you could just feel the emotion of laughter from both of us.
Wow.
And that's the only real memories I have of the actual lessons or teachings of it.
And were you anticipating these visits with any particular emotion?
It was a mix. So the whole time we lived there, I had an ongoing nightmare for years of white shadowy arms coming through the wall. And that was terrifying. That was a nightmare. I've always had this off and on, like when they're around, it's not as bad, but like the onset of seeing a craft or something usually terrifies me. And I don't really quite know how to explain that differential in my mind. It's just how I react to it.
So it sounds like you're saying what you remember clearly isn't particularly troubling, but you have a sense that there might be more that you don't remember that would be provoking this fear response in you. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, probably.
Do you think that's intentional on the part of your visitors?
Yes and no. I don't think the fear part's necessarily intentional. I think the memory block is, because I think if they really were here to just wipe us out or scare us, they wouldn't try to hide the memories as well. I mean, some of it's our own mind blocking trauma, but I think it's double dosed in these instances where I think they try to put a mental block on too, because they don't want you to be terrified. And
for your protection and out of compassion. Fascinating. So that went on for a period of weeks. After that, the next thing that I remember that made a big impression on me in the book didn't happen until 2010, but there were other experiences over the course of that in between what you just explained and what I'm going to ask you about in a minute in 2010. How much of that was going on an ongoing basis? And what did those encounters look like for you?
It's always come in a variety of demeanors. And, I think it's one of the problems is to classify as they. Over the years, I've seen different types of entities. I've seen different not even like beings, but I've had, weird animal encounters that shouldn't have happened or shouldn't be real and stuff. So it's a kind of a bigger picture than just us, them, ships, and big-eyed creatures.
How do you reconcile that in your head? Like, what do you think is the big picture here?
I think even though it's terrifying to most. I think most of the encounters are probably for a higher purpose, but we just don't understand it. I try to look at it like when we tag an animal for scientific purposes to, get samples and try to help it out or the whole species out. It must be miserably confusing and scary and horrible for the animal, but it's for the better good. And I think the animal doesn't understand the bigger good the same way we don't understand the bigger good in this type situation.
Mm-hmm. So you think it's scientific in nature on the part of whoever these beings are?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's done with purpose. I don't pretend to know the purpose, but I don't think it's an accident. I think it's a very defined purpose and plan on their part.
So you talked about a number of different types of entities and experiences that you've had. Do you think it's all coordinated, that there's a some kind of master plan as it relates to you personally, or do you think there's a lot of things going on and you're particularly sensitive to these types of experiences?
A little bit of both. I mean, I try to look at it one way. If you're building a house, you don't just have one person build the whole house. You have different, teams. You have plumbers, electricians, framers, contractors. So I think there's levels of that going on too, where certain species, races, or whatever have their job and they do that, others do that. Going back to the visitations that were happening frequently, the last time I saw them, I I looked up or down and I was about 15 feet in the air and I saw my back stairs that we didn't use. They're just like three little rickety steps that went into the laundry room and that you had to go through to get into my room. And I was confused. So I kind of pulled my head back to look around and I saw blood on this white cloth in front of me. And then I realized the blood was coming from my nose. And I pulled back and realized that the white cloth was that female entity bringing me back down. I don't remember how we got into that room, but once we were in the room, there were the two males and the female. And like I said before, the two males are usually very strict. They knew the next move. They had their lesson plan, I guess, for lack of a better term. They were frantic, in my opinion, pacing around, and they were all kind of like that, nervous and worried. The difference was this time was I could actually see them, and they looked kind of like your typical, gray aliens that's commonly described, but they're kind of more of a white porcelain type configuration with a blue to purplish hue. And my perception of the situation was that they stepped in between more of an abduction type scenario that maybe they shouldn't have. It's hard to say without knowing, but
like a rescue.
Yeah,
wow,
that's what it really felt like. And it almost felt like they weren't supposed to, like there's some type of hierarchy or rules between them up there. And that was the last time I ever saw them. So I do think there's some cases where it is just horrible. They're never going to like it. They're never going to get used to it situation. I do think there's a side that is for our own good, even if we find it scary.
Absolutely mind-blowingly fascinating. You speak of it, like it happens every day, because for you it does. For me, I cannot believe I'm having this conversation with you. What do you say when you encounter people who are aware of your story or are exposed to your story at an event and come up to you and say, I just don't believe a word you're saying? Does that have any impact on you at all? And how do you respond?
It used to, really kind of get to you like, am I crazy? And you'd play that whole mind game. A lot of us, who've been through this wish we were crazy. There's medications for that. There's nothing you can do about this. But yeah, for the most part now, I just go then, well, I guess you weren't the one I was talking to, I don't try to waste my time with negative energy. If somebody's not going to believe, they're not going to believe. I'm not looking for the person. I'm not looking to get an argument or to prove anything. I'm looking to help somebody who needs it. And that's kind of our whole motto with Granite Skies. It's people, not proof.
I kind of see myself as a bridge, because I've had a lifelong, very intense interest in paranormal phenomena, specifically the UFO and alien abduction phenomena. I don't know exactly why that's been such a topic of interest for me, but it has been really forever. but I wouldn't consider myself a part of that community. I'm not an experiencer. I truly don't know what to make of this. But I've spent a great deal of time reading books, listening to audiobooks, watching podcasts, watching documentaries in a very deliberate effort to try to understand to the extent that it can be understood and make sense of this whole thing. It's clear that something's going on. So most of my listeners probably have not done any kind of a deep dive into this subject, but I've exposed myself to a lot of media that talks about the abduction phenomena and the commonality in the stories that you could listen to 1,000 stories, 1,000 transcripts, audio transcripts of hypnosis sessions, and you are going to hear some of the same elements described over and over and over and over. And, you can respond to that from a neurological perspective. You can respond to it from a paranormal perspective. You can respond to it in a number of different ways. But what you can't deny is that something is going on that's affecting thousands and thousands of people all over the world over decades. And for my listeners, what I'm trying to do here is just to stimulate them to think about this maybe a little more deeply than they ever have. Why? Because why make up your mind about things that you've only spent 5 minutes thinking about? And hopefully we can engage each other and engage our own minds on these subjects, because I honestly believe there's a reason that we exist. And a big part of that reason has to do with, as you say, learning lessons. We're here to learn something. And if we're not spending time thinking, we're wasting the life that we've been given. And that means thinking about everything under the sun, not just the things that make sense to you, not just the things that are easy to believe, but particularly the things that, are hard to think about because they're elusive or confusing. You don't have a choice, it seems, about that. You have to think about it on a daily basis because it impacts your daily life. I'd like to move ahead to a moment in 2010 that I alluded to a little earlier, where you had an opportunity to discover that first encounter you told us about at 3 years old actually had more to it in that block of missing memory. What do you want to tell me about what happened in that experience?
Yeah, so I ended up going in for a hypnosis session. I was working with a paranormal team at the time. The hypnotist was having paranormal issues at his house. So we kind of traded them, said we'll do an investigation, have our medium go in and clear it and do all that stuff. In trade, they all wanted in between life regressions. And that's what I thought I was getting too. And then when it was my turn, they're like, oh no, we want to find out what happened there. So we ended up doing, everybody else got past life regressions. I went back to regress this encounter.
They knew your story. That was why it wasn't something they picked up psychically. In other words, they knew your story.
We had all worked together, friends, and they'd because they were just as curious as hopefully your listeners are. You regressed me and brought me back, and everything kind of flowed with what I remembered up until the blank. So in between that blank and this object being at the other end of the driveway by the road, it would appear that we were taken on board the craft. I don't remember like a light beam or getting, there's still quite a bit of fear internally going into this hypnogression about what I was going to see. So I didn't get a lot of details, but it did open up some. The first thing I remember is kind of like this, almost looked like a ramp or something, almost made out of like siding, like a metal building would have, but not as like bumpy. It was kind of more of a flat surface. The next thing from there, I saw this creature, but I only saw it from like the waist up and only to about the shoulders. And it was kind of this olivey green, maybe brownish mixed in with it. The skin looked wet, not like dripping wet, not like you just got out of a lake or something, but it had a shine to it. But the oddest feature was it seemed like on its wrist, there was almost like an extra bone between the forearm and the wrist, and it kind of like a chicken wing or something almost. As I was watching it, he looked crunched in the area, and it was odd to come back out of seeing that and to feel like sympathy for this thing. because my impression of the whole thing was that he was just crunched. Like that wasn't his normal thing. He normally wasn't there all the time. Further into the regression, the next thing I remember, I was in a well lit room. It was bright but not blinding. And I don't know if I was laying on something or floating. I couldn't feel anything under me, but I knew I wasn't standing up anymore, that I was laying down. Well, this was going on. I could sense beings around me or figures around me. At first, it was one by each shoulder and one by my head. And then there came this recognition that this was like a checkup or something. Like I didn't see medical instruments or anything like that, but it really had that feeling of like a checkup. And with it came a familiarity that, although I have no prior memories of it, that this has happened before.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah, it was a weird mix of like a checkup feeling, but also it almost kind of felt like a birthday party too. Not that they were celebrating me, but there was some form of happiness of a reunion. So after that, there were still figures around me, but there seemed to be a lot of commotion by my feet and legs. And as we moved through the hypnosis session, the commotion at my feet was really starting to bother me, what was going on. And then as we moved through and I figured out the commotion at my feet wasn't really about me, it was more of a distraction. It was them working on my cousin as well. And that's like, then I snapped out of the regression and was done.
And did you come out of the regression remembering everything that had happened, or was that something you heard on a playback?
I remembered it in real time after the regression, but not in real time of the event. Yes.
What did your cousin have to say when you brought that story?
So yeah, it was after that. That's when I decided I need to call my cousin up and talk in earnest about this. So I told her everything I remembered, and then added the hypnosis stuff that I had just gone through it. And that's why I was calling to, see what she remembered. And she's like, I believe you, but that's not what I remember. I don't remember that. She's like, I remember when we were sitting on Graham's porch back at my grandmother's again, looking out, we're on the farmer's porch, looking out at the property that we would then move into, the backyard behind that house. And this red light came into the sky and started, like, I say dancing, but literally like making figure eights. And it really like put on a show for us. And when she started telling me, it clicked in and I started to remember that. But we both grew up for much younger. That happened, I think, when we were like 8 or 9 in my memory. And the other one happened so much earlier but we never discussed, the UFO we saw growing up. That to me, it doesn't make sense. She's saying this happened here, but has a childhood before that of saying, remember the UFO we saw.
Has she ever sought out any form of hypnosis herself or deeper answers, or does she avoid the topic?
She doesn't necessarily avoid it. She's had some other interesting things happen. Like when she was a kid, she was never on a plane, but she was adamant she had seen the Statue of Liberty from above. I don't know if she still had sightings or things like that she didn't recall, but she became more mediumistic. She would be in my grandmother's house just talking to somebody in an empty room. My grandmother would come in and she'd be like, who are you talking to? And she'd be like, the old lady with the bad back, and give a perfect description of my grandmother's grandmother, who she had never met, and things like that. So she kind of got more paranormal stuff, where mine was more UFO-y.
Do you talk about it with her today?
Here and there. There were some family issues somewhere along the lines. My mother and aunt don't really see eye to eye. So we still talk now and try to patch everything up between everybody. But we still talk about it. She's got a huge interest in it, but she just doesn't have a lot of memories on it.
And so I would imagine she doesn't feel traumatized the way that some of your experiences have traumatized you.
Yeah, she doesn't have that with it.
So it must have been some comfort to have another person to talk about this with over the years. It's validating, and it helps you know that you're not crazy. Your experiences, and not just you and your cousin, they have not been confined to you personally. So I know that you spend a lot of time camping in the New Hampshire forests. and that there have been times you've had people with you that have been affected. What's that been like for them, and how has it impacted relationships for you?
Yeah, that could be very difficult. So my daughter in particular, we were out camping once, and she's seen stuff with me on other trips and stuff. But this one site we go to, it's a little remote site you got to hike in and get to and stuff. We've had quite a few weird things happen. One day there was just this weird penetrating buzz coming from nowhere. There was no, source for the sound. She heard it, I heard it, her friend heard it, but nothing else happened that day that we could remember. A couple of years later, we're back in the same spot. Cell phones don't really work. They're iffy in that area. So her and her friend, they walked out to go to the bathroom and check their phones up in the parking lot where they got reception. And she's been in that campground as long as she could walk. So she knows it pretty well. They did what they were going to do when they were coming back to the campsite. They got about 10 feet down the trail. She heard an owl hoot and ended up through the woods on the other end of the park. And she eventually found her. They made their way back to camp, but
was that a missing time experience? Like, was that an instantaneous thing, or was there something in between?
They don't have any recall. The friend didn't really want to discuss it at all, and actually they stopped being friends after that. And she doesn't remember. She knows she heard the owl, knows where she came out, and she doesn't. Because I don't know how long they took in the bathroom to this or that. So I can't judge how long they were gone. It was getting to be a little bit like, all right, let's hurry it up and get back. But they don't really know if they missed any time. It wasn't.
But it was a one moment they were here, and the next moment of awareness, they were somewhere they shouldn't have been able to be.
Then they shouldn't have been able to be there time-wise. They shouldn't have been able to get there walking through the woods, through over rocks and stuff without lights or anything. It just shouldn't have happened.
Were they frightened when they arrived back at your site?
They were shook up, not necessarily scared, but confused and just, I think, glad to be back. I'm pretty open with my stuff, so my daughter's aware of all of it. So I was not being. She's like, you don't understand. I just was trying not to chuckle. I'm like, I think I do.
How did you counsel them at the time?
Just being back by the fire seemed to help them, and just knowing I think it was still in that shock period. So it wasn't overwhelming fear or overwhelming disbelief. It was still just like, what happened? So they transitioned back pretty quickly for the rest of the night.
And they slept in the tents at the campsite. Yeah. So you've told me in the past conversations that we've had that you do spend a lot of time camping, a lot of times in the forest and in the mountains, and that you frequently have experiences there as well. And I've got to tell you, Mike, the last place in the world I would want to be if I had a lifetime of experiences like this is by myself in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. Tell me why you're drawn there and why you feel comfortable there.
Yeah, I mean, you get to this point. One, I'm very much into nature and I love camping. I've always grown up in it, and and I love animals, and so to me that's got a nature of comfort to it in and of itself. Plus, with all this stuff that you have anxieties of this and that, so like being away, that's calming as well. And not having to think about this, that, or anything, and just watching a tree sway in the breeze. Sometimes it's the most comforting thing. But you get to this other point where it doesn't matter if you're alone in the woods. It doesn't matter if you're at the house surrounded by people. If they're gonna come, they're gonna come. So for a lot of people, yeah, I get that. I've been asked that before. They're like, "Why would you go isolate yourself out in the middle of nowhere?" And it's because I enjoy it, and it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I can understand that. Wherever you are, you're subject to these experiences. So I guess it comes from growing up. When you think you hear a bump in the night, the first thing you want to do is be around a lot of people and turn all the lights on. And those are hard things to do in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night. But good for you for staying true to yourself. And I think there's probably a reason why you love it there, why you find peace there. So to have a safe place like that and to take advantage of it frequently, that is something you do have control over. When you have things you can't control, having that safe space is maybe not always so safe, but it's good that you have that place where you can find peace. And speaking of not always being safe, you did tell me in our last conversation about a recent experience in the woods. Would you care to share that one with our audience? Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Yeah, I believe so.
Mhm.
So this would have been just over a year and a half ago. I was out camping. I'd done all my chores, had the hammock set up for the night, firewood collected, cooked dinner and all that. I was just kind of sitting there. I was on relax mode by the fire. And the next thing I know, I was in the middle of a patch of woods and had no idea where I was or how I got there. I could see a fallen log up ahead. And I said, all right, I'm going to walk up to that and I'm going to sit down and gather my head and try to figure out what happened, where I am, and all that. And as I got closer to the stump, I could see what looked like a clearing in front of me. And in that clearing, I could see five large, by large, they were about double the size of a piece of plywood. So like 8 by 16 panes of glass. They were all unison in a row. They were probably connected, but I couldn't see anything connecting to them. All I could see were these black, shiny glass panels in this clearing. I decided that was not the way I wanted to go. So I started heading out the other direction. I knew if I was anywhere close to where I started, I was on a peninsula of land. So I should have water on three sides of me. My goal was to just keep walking until I hit water. Then I could put my back against a tree and sleep for the night or hopefully recognize shoreline where I was. So I probably walked for about 45 minutes in the dark. I didn't have a flashlight or anything on me. I wasn't expecting to be out there. And I eventually hit water and I decided I was going to follow the shoreline just for a little bit because I really didn't want to stay out there. I wanted to get back to camp. And I came across a mylar balloon that had washed up on the shore that I'd seen earlier in the day. So from there, I knew how to get back to another spot I used to camp up there. And from there, knew how to get to where I was staying that night and finally made my way back. The fire wasn't very big when I left it, but it was burnt out when I got back. I got it re-going. And then I stayed up by it just for the rest of the night until 4:30 in the morning until the sun started coming back up, and then crawled into the hammock to sleep because I felt at least safe with the sun up.
Yeah, you'd been stumbling around in the woods in the dark all night. I bet you were tired. Were you feeling fear during that time? Were you annoyed? Were you like, I can't believe this is happening again, or just disoriented? What was going through your head while you were trying to find your way back to your site?
I mean, disorientation, definitely. Fear, not so much from them or whatever, but more fear of being stranded in the middle of the woods with no idea where I was, no supplies, no anything. At that point, I didn't know if I was in the same state or what had happened.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was annoyed because, like I said, this was fairly recent. This was only like a year or so ago. Kind of half jokingly in my mind, I was kind of like, what is this? I want VIP service at this point. Like, bring me back to where you started from.
I think you've earned that.
Yeah.
Your backstage pass.
Yeah.
Wow.
But that's one thing I find a lot of experience really have a great sense of humor because it's that fight or flight response you're in all the time. And there's not a lot you can really do about it. So laughing is amazing. It's an amazing coping tool.
I imagine so. Since you never know when you're going to have an experience or what that experience is going to be, you strike me as a remarkably composed person. I might be a quivering mess if it were me. Where does the peace come from in you?
It's only on the outside. My brain, I can't shut it off. I have high anxiety, just to constantly think, overthink. And it gets a little crazy in there sometimes trying to keep up with it. But
I imagine so. So let's talk about Granite Skies and how you got to a place where you felt that you had your own internal experience sufficiently under control that you wanted to reach out for others, and how that, according to your intro, is a mutually beneficial experience. It helps you as well as the people you're helping. When did that start for you?
About 2008 is when it really started triggering. had a bone spur that was shredding my Achilles tendon. So I had to go in for surgery, and that put me on the couch. So I was watching all the paranormal shows every day. Kathleen Martin, the Betty and Barney Hill's niece, had just written her book Captured. So I had just read that, and somewhere between the pain pills and all that, it just kind of clicked through. I'm like, why are you watching and reading all this stuff? Why aren't you doing something about it? Like, you know how to do it, just do it. So I found a paranormal group to join to do that. But what I also did was I started a petition, which is the process all of our historical state markers have to go through to get a historical marker for Betty and Barney Hill put up. And so those two projects kind of like fell on each other. It's like I needed people to sign the petition. So I joined the paranormal group, but plus I wanted to start doing the paranormal stuff. And from there, we began investigating, and we finally got a brick and mortar building and started a center to have these types of discussions, about anything that people didn't consider normal, mediums, Bigfoot, the UFO stuff. And so we started a group to just get people talking about experiences and just try to start opening up the doors for that. And from there, it was good. It was a first step, but from there it was just more fodder, like you were talking about at the beginning of the show, where you can only read so much, do so much, hear so much. Talking about it at that surface level wasn't enough. That's when I decided to kind of switch gears. Like, that stuff's all fine, has its place, but I really want to work with the people who have been through this and focus on that.
I imagine you'd been encountering those people during this period leading up to that at paranormal events. Were they just casual conversations, or did you have people asking you to help them? How did it get to a point where you said, I have something to offer these people that they can't do for themselves?
Well, because within those conversations, they were pretty open. And then, people would argue about more the nuts and bolts side of ufology. So people who've had experiences would see people arguing about, I hate to say simple things, but what they were interested in needed to work through simple things. And they didn't feel comfortable sharing their most inner private thoughts to be picked apart in that type of atmosphere. Like you said earlier, well, what if somebody says you're crazy? How do you react? And a lot of these people were not at a point, where they wanted to do that publicly or something. So seeing that and dealing with that and doing it a little bit on the side after a meeting, it really just became apparent. Also, I think a lot of it wasn't me as much as it was me. I feel there was some type of internal calling and push to do that type of work.
Do you remember the first person you actually worked with in that capacity, where it was a very deliberate, I'm going to help this person experience?
Yeah. So we had recently done a conference which we had spoke out and said we were doing this type of work. And then we were doing monthly meetings at the time, and they came to one, and then they listened to, kind of sat through the group. This wasn't actually a support group. This one was more of an open topic group. We decided we had to split those two things up. And she approached me, and I began working with her. And then as we, started getting into all the stuff she had experienced and dealt with over time and stuff, I ended up then working with the husband, and then working with the daughter, because it doesn't just affect the person it affects, sometimes literally and otherwise. But yeah, so ended up working with the whole family. I still work with her today, and it's one of those things they tell you, you always, you got to keep it professional. Don't get too involved with your client's life. And then when you do this type of work, you have to build that trust. You have to really know them and let them really know you.
I know that New England in general tends to be a highly concentrated area for these kinds of phenomena. So how many people would you say in your local region you've been able to reach out to through Granite Skies?
I mean, it's hard to say, between festivals and interviews like this, the reach in the internet now, just the reach can be probably mind blowing. But we're a little smaller right now, coming back after the COVID years and getting our feedback on the ground. We lost our meeting space for a little bit during all that, but we generally we used to have easily 30 people, at a meeting. all experiencers. We were doing meetings once a week, different flavors. Some would just be a social, some would be support, things like that. But yeah, we always maintained a pretty good outpouring, which is not that we're doing something right necessarily. It's just that there needs to be more outreach for these people in general. There's another group in Maine that we work really closely with. If somebody calls me and they're closer to them, I send them to them, and vice versa. And there's no real competition in this New England area, at least. We all are really just trying to help each other out.
It seems there would be no reason to divide. The
Right.
important thing is to come together in your common experience and try to make sense of it and figure out how to continue to exist in a world full of people who aren't having these experiences and somehow be okay in the middle of that. I do know I'm a New Yorker, born and bred. I'm here in Florida 17 years now, but recently was in, where was I? The Hudson Valley in New York, where they have an area that has a concentration of stone chambers. Are you familiar with these? That they're in the woods all over the place. Sometimes they're in people's backyards, and they appear to have that ancient, construction where you can't understand how these heavy stones were lifted into place, what these chambers were actually for. I believe that I may have had a UFO sighting in Massachusetts. We were at a ski lodge staying in a condo, and I remember standing at the back door looking out. It was a well-lit area. There were street lights, but I stood at that back door for a good 10-15 minutes staring at a light that didn't seem to belong. And many times when people have sightings, it is in the form of a light. Sometimes they are only lights, but they move in a way that doesn't seem to fit and doesn't seem to make sense. And it certainly fits the actual definition of UFO or UAP. I don't know what it is, and it's flying, and so it fits the criteria. And I remember saying to my husband at the time, I think I just saw a UFO. And then we laughed it off and forgot about it. And for years, I thought that I was simply being silly. But every time I think back on it, I feel certain that I wasn't being silly. There was something odd about that. I can't lose the feeling. So I know, well, you mentioned Betty and Barney Hill a moment ago, and congratulations for the work that you did for your area to mark the site where the very first abduction encounter that was reported and became public news ever happened. It's great that you did that. You also are home to the Exeter event, which is another big thing. And there's a festival that takes place in your area every year that you're a part of, I know. And you get some pretty credible support attached to that in your community. It seems that the whole alien/UFO thing has been embraced by law enforcement, by nonprofit organizations, and you actually are holding events that fundraise. So tell us a little bit about community work.
With everything we do, it's trying to give it back to somebody, whether it's the individual who needs help or the community at large. The Exeter Festival is great. It's actually a Kiwanis fundraiser. So all the money raised goes to local children's charity. The original incident at Exeter that happened in 1965 involved 2 Exeter police officers who witnessed this object, as well as a local man. So the Exeter Police Department over the years, whether it's just public relations or not, they've become really involved with the festival. They help promote it. They made patches this year with little alien heads on it, which were amazing. I don't think they realized how many people wanted them. They sold out in 14 minutes. It was,
wow.
Yeah.
I want one.
I do too. I think they've seen the public demand and they're going to reprint some.
That's awesome. And I love how that's integrated into the community, that whether or not, everybody on the force is a believer, it's been embraced. So the community can breathe. You can do what you do without running into any resistance in an area where there seems to be a high concentration of phenomenon going on. That to me sounds like a, hashtag life goals to me, to have that kind of integrated approach to this.
Yeah, it was an instant. When the festival first started, some of the downtown businesses decided they'd close for the weekend because they didn't want to be associated with it. Now you walk down the main street where most of the events happen and stuff. Every storefront's got a UFO or a blow up alien in it. Some of them go way out and overboard, and it's just the whole town kind of.
You're like a mini Roswell.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Well, Mike, I'm very grateful that you wanted to come and tell some of this story. I'm glad that you're helping people. I'm glad your community is on board with this. I'm glad that you're finding peace in the middle of so much chaos. What do you think is going on with regard to you specifically? Apparently, you've been selected, it seems to me, and in the reading that I've done, that appears to be the case, that people have their first experiences when they're very young and appear to be followed, sometimes families, through generations or through, their entire lifetime. What's your personal belief right now about why you and what's going on?
I think why me is because of the family thing. We grew up, we could talk about ghosts all the time. My grandfather's house was haunted, and we all knew it. And it wasn't a big, ghosts weren't a big deal. We could have that conversation openly and did frequently, but nobody talked about UFOs. So when I got the marker put up, my mother was telling her cousins and this and that, and it kind of spread around the family. And that's when, it came out that almost everybody in my family has at least seen a UFO. My great uncle was kicked out of a private school up here in New Hampshire in the mid 60s for claiming he was abducted by aliens. The school said it's drugs or a mental illness. Either way, we're not equipped to deal with it. So from the past generations, parents have seen UFOs. My daughter's seen UFOs. I'm just part of the chain. Why our particular family, I don't particularly know.
What do you think about the whole segment of your community, and by that I mean experiencers, who claim that they are part of a hybridization program and who talk about feeling like they may be hybrids, or that they have seen hybrid children that they have incubated in their bodies for a period of time? What's your feeling about that whole path of this phenomenon?
I used to think it was crazy at first. The more I look at it, and the more research I've done, and the more people I've talked to, even if you go back to the Betty and Barney Hill case, there's reproductive testing. There was actually a case out of Brazil before theirs, which just didn't get any credibility. This farmer said UFO came, took him up, had intercourse with him, and dropped him off. And everybody said, "You're crazy," and pushed it away. So I think when people talk about it, they almost do it in one of two ways. They either just say, "No, that's absolutely nuts. There's no way it can happen," or they over romanticize it, kind of like they do with the Twilight movies or something. I think if we look at it, the middle ground, actually look what's going on, I think it's possible. And I think the bigger part of that is we have to look at what that means, because I can't take a dog and a giraffe and mix their DNA and make a long necked dog. They're not a compatible species. So if we're able to hybrid, that means there's a connection somewhere. And I think that's a mind-blowing thing to look at.
For sure. Do you think that they're one of the things that I find fascinating when I do the mental exercise and I try to figure things out, and I'm not saying, I'm just asking what sits comfortably with you. And the reason I want to know what you think in particular is because of your experiences. You may not remember the lessons that you talked about earlier, but apparently there's been some form of guidance. Whether or not you remember them, there must have been a purpose for them. So there must be a way that those are operating in your life today. And so I think you might have some intuitive sense that maybe I don't have access to. What I find fascinating is when people start saying, well, gee, here are these craft. We don't know what they are. We know they're not ours. Are they extraterrestrial? That's the first thing people say. Are they coming from some other planet? Well, if they are coming from some other planet, are they the people that seeded Earth with us to begin with? Like, did we originally come from there? And they're coming back to check on us because they brought us here? Or are they us time traveling, or us interdimensionally traveling? What is your feeling about all of those theories?
I think there's plausibility to a lot of them, knowing which one's the right one. I think they've been here as long as we've been here, but they've probably been here longer. I don't know if I necessarily support the prison planet thing, but yeah, I could get on board with they seeded us here on Earth.
More of a laboratory planet than a prison planet.
Yeah, but I can also kind of see that maybe they are. Again, I'm trying not to use the word they because it's too ambiguous, but I don't know if that could be the start, but maybe the end is that what we're seeing now is us from the future, them from the future coming back to fix whatever got messed up along the timeline. I don't think time works the way we think it works to begin with. I don't think it's linear. It's just how we understand it. So trying to factor that into the whole picture is convoluted as well.
Yeah, we're limited by our own capacity to understand. We know enough now in modern physics to know that there are things that we can figure out mathematically that we can't observe for ourselves, that we can't prove. There are more quantum theories than there are quantum facts, I think.
Yeah.
So we have an inkling that there's a lot more going on than we can comprehend. And I find that endlessly fascinating. I'm probably more interested in theoretical physics than anybody who doesn't study physics. It's just a fascinating thing to me. I would love to wrap this interview up, if I could, by taking a quote that I have from you and asking you to elaborate on what you mean by it. The sentence that I saw said, Mike hopes to combine his simple New England values with his own experiences to give people a positive new outlook on the phenomena. Since your own experiences, by your own definition, have not always been positive, and that they've impacted people around you, not always in a positive way, you're dealing with other experiencers who need support and assistance navigating this. Where does the positive new outlook fit into the picture? What is the positive outlook? What are you hoping to accomplish?
I think there's a bigger problem that we just discussed, whether I don't know if we can ever understand it. And we're ramming our heads against the wall, trying to understand it. And to me, I see it like if a building's on fire and there's people trapped in it. Why are we wasting our time trying to figure out how the fire started? Let's get the people out of the building first. Let's not put the cart before the horse. If you just simplify it, just be nice to people. You don't have to believe, but you don't have to be a jerk to them either. If you've got an extra sandwich, somebody's hungry, offer them a sandwich. If they're cold and they got an extra sweatshirt, and this is no different to me. It's just that simple. If somebody's been through something that I've been through and I can console them, or just even if it's just letting them know that they're not alone, then that's, it's just that simple.
So the positivity is in the connectedness, in whether you're an experiencer or not. Just spread a message of compassion and tolerance, and just to take each other at our word sounds like what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's the old, you never know what battle somebody else is fighting, so just be nice.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Anything else you wanted to share with the listeners in case they want to take the next step after hearing this podcast?
Yeah, so you can find me on Facebook. It's just Granite Sky Services, and it should pop up. And the website is granitesky.org.
Well, thank you. I am very grateful for the opportunity to have a face-to-face conversation with you after reading your story. It means the world to me. So I guess you could call me a fangirl in a way, except that it's more genuine than that. And it's not, it's not that surface. It's helping me put the pieces together. And I hope that the audience has had their minds lit up as a result of having heard your story today. I'm very grateful for Mike's willingness to share his story with me and with you. One of the things I was really struck by was how he doesn't fill in the gaps. And there are a lot of gaps in his story. So if there's a block of time that he cannot account for, if there's a moment where he thinks he saw something, but he wasn't sure, if there's something that happened and he doesn't have an explanation for how it happened, he will say, hey, I don't know. And that sends a message of sincerity. Somebody who's being deceptive is pretty likely to have their story well crafted and well thought out. And they try to anticipate your answers. Mike's been telling his story for a long time. So he's had lots of opportunities to fill in those gaps and to come up with things that might sound plausible, in which case his story would sound a lot more like a Netflix series than a real life experience, but he doesn't do that. He tells you honestly from the heart what he experienced and what he's thinking. I found that to be compelling. It was exactly what I hoped for in reaching out to have this conversation. I wanted to satisfy myself. Hey, I've read this book. Is this guy for real? And you know what? I think he is. That's my opinion. There's more of my opinion in the blog entry that I've written about this episode. So if you're interested in hearing more about my point of view, you could go over there and read it. But I'm more interested in hearing your point of view. Would you engage? Let me know. Just, let's get started building a community here, people. I've got several other series coming up after this. They're all going to be interesting. So let's just join hands, engage our brains, and then talk about it. If you're just joining me for the first time, you may not know that I end all of my episodes with a parting thought. And today my parting thought is a poem. It's a poem that I received in the mail from my friend Scott Cuso. Scott did a watercolor on a lovely piece of art paper, and then he used an actual old-fashioned typewriter to type out a poem that he also wrote. So it's art on art on art, and I couldn't be happier with it. Not to mention the fact that it's a really good poem. So I can share that part of it with you now. And here it is. Hold the door. Hold a hand. Hold your tongue. Smile back. Smile first. Smile at dogs. Smile at babies. Share a joke. Share a hug. Share a beer. Share a moment. Look them in the eye. See their heart. Support. Encourage. Compliment. Write the note. Leave that message. Make those cookies. Do it anonymously. Raise their flag. Raise the roof. Cheer them on. Follow up. Follow through. Be intentional. Love fearlessly. That might be some of the best advice you'll get for the entirety of 2023. Next week, we have part 2 of Personal Paranormal Encounters. I encourage you to rejoin me for that. And in the meantime, I want to say thanks for listening. Come on back, and I will see you next time. Cool Gray in Studio A is a fine-tuned services production. It exists for entertainment purposes and is not intended to be used as a sole source of information or advice on any subject. Find and follow this podcast at coolgraystudios.com.